We have a big fight at women's strawweight, and finally, we keep seeing more and more talent coming through that Invicta pipeline. And Kanako Murata coming in, the former Invicta strawweight champ. She just picked up the biggest win of her career over Emily Ducati out there. A split decision win, but she became that strawweight queen. Now going to apply her talents against Quiet Storm, Canada's Randa Markos, coming out of Windsor, Ontario, in Canada. And listen, Matt, Randa Markos broke a terrible trend in her last time out. It was just win one, lose one, pepper in a couple of draws. Well, she ended up losing to Amanda Hebas and then Mackenzie Dern in her last time out. Got submitted very quickly in that one. Now, for Kanako Murata, you look at the record, 11-1. The only loss is to Rin Nakai, and if you want to see the wildest career, look at Rin Nakai. Her two UFC fights, she gets the call up at 16-0 and gets Misha Tate, and then Leslie Smith loses those two.
It's gonna happen.
And see you later. But for Kanako Murata, I look at that overall body of work, very, very decent level of talent coming up through. And then that Invicta run after competing with Ryzen. Liana Pirozin, she gets a rear naked choke win there, and then just continued to really threaten in her fight against Emily Ducati. For Randa Markos, we know what it is. It's that frustrating style with her hands out, that striking that you get. And it's Randa Markos' wrestling and the defensive submissions off her back that really kind of threaten against just about all level of talent. And if you really want to be hard on Randa Markos, I know the UFC website is going to show that maybe she's 10-10 with the one draw. Listen, that one extra loss was on The Ultimate Fighter. It was a 3-rounder. It's considered an exhibition bout. I just gave her benefit of the doubt and put 10-9-1 on that graphic. But for Randa Markos, the level of competition's always been there.
100%.
She's beaten a former UFC champ in Claudia Esparza. She's fought former title challengers former titleists. She's got a fight against Rose Namajunas. Didn't win that one. She lost to Karolina Kovalkiewicz. She's fought the Juliana Limas, the Nina Ansaroff. She beat Angela Hill. I can go on and on about this fight, Matt, but stylistically, these fighters are actually quite similar. We have a national wrestling champion in Kanako Murata making her debut. You have Randa Markos. It's just pretty well a picture of consistency. What do you make of this one? Because I think it's a fun fight.
So I think every woman who joins the strawweight division has to fight Randa Markos at some point. And I don't even think it's just my rule. I think the UFC might have a rule for it too, because it seems like every time there's really anyone with some hype behind them in the strawweight division, the UFC goes, perfect. We're going to throw them on the Fight Pass prelims against Randa Markos. And it is unfortunate that that's kind of where she finds herself. And when you look at her record too, it is salty. But the level of competition definitely is there. And I would rather someone losing to high-level competition than just continuously beating a bunch of people who they know that they can beat. Because you never get any better if you just keep... Like, if I played Craig in basketball forever, I would never get any better. If Craig played me in hockey, he'd never get any better. Because there's just that big of a difference between those two sports. With Randa and her wrestling style, I do think Murata is going to be a really hard opponent to get to the mat. And I think this whole fight can be simplified as to who is the better wrestler out of these two. You know what you're going to get with Randa Markos. She got phenomenal top pressure. She has good submissions. We don't see enough of her submission game, I don't believe at least, because I would argue the best woman who she's fought recently would have been Angela Hill, and she beat her without much trouble. Like, she took her down immediately, got into full mount, had some really good positions, some really good grappling showed off in that fight. And for Markos too, we've kind of seen an inconsistency in her grappling, which doesn't really exist for most other MMA fighters. Like, when you think of Damian Maia, it's not like in some fights his jiu-jitsu's just kind of off. With Randa Markos, sometimes she goes out there and she's really wrestling dominant. She's going to go out, and if she can't get that first takedown attempt, she'll shoot 4, 5, 6 times until she can get the takedown. But then in other fights, she's a little bit more passive and lets the fight come to her. That cannot be the version of Randa Markos who comes to this fight, because for Kanako Murata, if she is the one pushing the pressure, getting Randa Markos on the back foot and forcing Markos to be defensive the whole fight, not only will it not look good for the judges, that's just the worst position for Markos. She's not great moving backwards, and I do think we saw that in the Claudia Gadelha fight. Awful fight. You don't need to rewatch it. We've done the research, so you don't have to. But Randa Markos basically just stands there and doesn't do a lot. And I know Claudia was probably conscious of the fact that Randa is one of those cardio machines, and Claudia herself, that'd be one of the bigger weaknesses of her game. So I'm sure she just didn't want to overexert herself to let Markos come in those last couple of rounds. But we do see such a stark contrast between the two different versions of Randa Markos that her at her best, she's not going to beat a Ioana Jędrzejczyk or a Rose Namajunas. Like, I'm not spoiling anything, but her at her best can beat those, 5 to 10 range fighters, and there's nothing wrong with that. So for Kanako Murata, if her wrestling is really up to that level, and if she can go out there and put on a dominant grappling performance against a fighter like Randa Markos, I really do think the sky's the limit. If she goes out there and outstrikes her, people can outstrike Randa Markos, but for you to be a grappler and going out there, and if you can out-grapple her, it's going to show us a lot more about your game and really tell us where your ceiling is.
And I mean, I look at this fight, and we had another debuting fighter that was a national wrestling champ just a couple of weeks ago in Lilia Storyarenko when she took on Lauren Murphy. Way too big of a step up in competition. Yeah. This is the perfect type of fight for Kanako Murata because, again, you get to know what you're going to get, and then maybe in her next fight, you match her up against a striker. So, ultimately, this is a really fun one. If we have a look at the odds, Matt, Kanako Murata opened up the favorite, and she's continued to climb as such. She opened a minus 130. She's now down to a minus 169 over on Best Fight Odds. If we look at Randa Markos, open plus 108. She's now at a plus 142. If we have a look at the Tapology votes, limited sample size, but out of 272 total votes, 78% going Murata, and they're mostly all 74% picking her to win by decision. I think that is probably the most simple path to victory, and I think that that's probably what we're going to get out of a lot of people who've watched tape on this fight. But do you disagree with the masses on this one?
I don't know if Randa Markos just sits at home and just religiously studies the judging criteria for MMA fights, but I've never seen a person eke out more grappling-heavy split decision wins in my whole life. And she's been on the wrong side of those, too. It kind of works both ways, because when you're always involved in these kind of, I don't want to say low volume because sometimes they're not, but when you're always involved in a lot of these stalemate matchups where it seems like every time Randa Markos lands a combination, her opponent's also landing at the same time. Or when she gets a takedown, well then her opponent gets up and takes her down for a minute. There's always kind of this ebb and flow to her fights, but she does know how to win rounds at the UFC level. And for nothing else, I do think that's a valuable experience level. And I'm going to pick the underdog in Randa Markos. I think she's been in this position so many times before where it's this young upstart who's coming over from outside the UFC. She's not supposed to win this fight. It's not like an Amanda Hebos fight, though, where I'm like, okay, there's no way Randa Markos can win this. Of course she didn't. It's a fight where, okay, stylistically, her opponent does a lot of the same things she does. We've seen that before in a woman named Carla Esparza, who was the UFC champ at one point. So I do think Randa Markos is going to be able to, quite frankly, Randa Markos her way to a win. Do just enough in the grappling area, land her good ground and pound, keep the fight in just frustrating scenarios for Kanako Murata, and she should be able to get the win.
I like this fight for Kanako Murata, and here's why. It's the fact that getting ready for a fight like this, and if you're training with such high-level talent like Kana Morimoto, who's a K1 champ at flyweight, that's definitely a great person to train with coming out of Silver Wolf Gym. But I mean, you look at Randa Markos, and the one question mark that I really have, we saw her against Mackenzie Dern in a fight that was into the pandemic. And Randa Markos, if you followed her career whatsoever, she's from the Windsor area. If you understand geography, it's a bit of a head scratch of a spot because it's a part of Canada, obviously, but it's lower than Detroit. So The thing with Randa Markos, she trains a bit in Windsor, and then she has a camp that's over in Michigan. Well, now with the way that the world is, it's a little difficult to go between Canada and the States. And for Randa Markos, listen, straight up, it's going to be hard to fight Mackenzie Dern. I know she was a big underdog in that fight, and it wasn't much of a surprise that Mackenzie Dern won that one. But for Markos, it's tough because you can't get all of the rounds in the States. You can't get all of the rounds in Canada. So for me, it's not necessarily an inconsistency out of Randa Markos because really it's a career of inconsistency. You look at the record, it is. But I like Kanako Murata in this one. I like that national wrestling pedigree. And as long as it's not a Lilia Stoliarenko type of performance, I do like Japan's Kanako Murata in this one, Matt. We continue to disagree on some of these fights.
I can't disagree with any of the points you made about this fight, though.
That's
That's the problem. Like, I think Randa Markos is going to win.
Okay.
There you go. I can't disagree with anything you said about Kanako Murata, though, and that's what makes this fight so fun.
And I think it's going to be a great one. So we disagree on the picks. I've got Murata, you've got Randa Markos, but hey, overall, this is one of those ones I'm just going to tip my cap, enjoy it for what it is, and I'm really looking forward to it. And there's a lot of fights on this card that, hey, just a lot of pure enjoyment. So make sure you check out the rest of the playlist. We've got a great lineup, and it's headed by Islam Makhachev taking on Rafael dos Anjos. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it.